I made a point of not viewing the tape of Galeazzi in advance. So I'm happy to say that there are many points of agreement, and yet I think I will be able to carry the story in other directions that complement what he had to say. The point, is there any way to get rid of this hum? It's not me. Is it outside? Okay. I can relax then. All right, so I think the point that's come across very clearly is that experience and perception are not passive things in our world, that we are concerned with the integration of perception and action, whether it is in, I really think it's the equipment, whether it's in the realm of memory or the realm of activity. I'm going to try and get a handle on this by starting with some work and thoughts of Peter Zumthor. Then I'm going to step back and talk about some of the challenges for neuroscience that I think this sort of conversation can offer. And then I'm going to talk at length about Utzon's Sydney Opera House. So let's start here in Vals in Switzerland at the thermal baths that Peter Zumthor designed. I'm not going to talk about this at length, but just to introduce some facts. There's the harmony of the building with the landscape. There's also the way in which, in various places, the landscape is framed by the building and offered by the building. But also, the nature of the pools is totally transformed, and yet their temperature, their sensory experience, their tactile sense informs one experience of the building. And finally, in this very small sample, the stone is the local gneiss, which gives the a further unity with the surrounding mountainside. But what I want to use Peter for today is just to quote a few of the things he said in a little essay called A Way of Looking at Things. And the first is a theme that came up quite a lot in the previous talk, but which I will attack in a while from a somewhat different direction: the relation between memory, image, and imagination. And I want to, in some sense, probe a little deeper than simply saying memory and imagination have things in common by looking at this quote. When I think about architecture, images come into my mind. When I design, I frequently find myself sinking into old, half-forgotten memories, yet at the same time, I know that all is new, and there is no direct reference to a former work of architecture. So that issue of how can our brain be such that memories can be invoked, not to relive the original episode, but to create something that's completely new. The second point I want to make is from Zumthor's discussion of the relation between whole and detail. Also his way of invoking function. At the same time, he is thinking about form. Unlike the sculptor, I have to start with functional and technical requirements. The challenge of developing a whole out of innumerable details, out of various functions and forms, materials and dimensions, and the details lead to an understanding of the whole of which they are an intrinsic part. And I just want to add another point, which must be familiar to all of you who practice architecture, or actually do almost anything, and that is, what is the whole at one time may become the part, and what is the part may become a whole for a whole new journey of exploration. So this interaction between wholes and details, which are defining each other. The whole is not defined when you start to design the building, and many of the details will emerge as the whole is refined, and then those very details will change your conception of the whole at multiple levels. All right, so the knowledge of how to make things. Okay, so at this point I want to change pace and get into neuroscience for a while. And the whole tenor of this meeting, I think, has been to see neuroscience and other aspects of science as an available resource. And the issue has been, how can we help architects by bringing these ideas into architectural discourse and into education and into the practice of design. But I recall a noted president of the United States in suggesting that there is a real vitality also in saying that neuroscience itself is a plastic changing subject. We're constantly finding new challenges as we seek to understand the human brain and the brains of other species. And so I'm also interested in how do we bring back to individual neuroscientists the excitement of trying to understand questions that are offered by the practice of architecture. And it's not going to be plug and play. We'll hear an attempt at plug and play next on the program. But this is more the issue of how do we go back to the basics of neuroscience, get new insights to add to the stock that Professor Gallesi talked about to enrich our conversation. So let me just look quickly at three notions of neuroscience. The notion of an affordance, how even perception may involve construction, and returning to our theme of the afternoon, how episodic memory and imagination relate to each other. So this moderately complex diagram goes back to 1976. It's by a psychologist, Ulrich Neisser. And I don't know how much you can see from where you sit, but the idea is there are two concentric circles which emphasize the relation between action and perception. And the inner circle is concerned with things like eye movements or moving around to get a closer look and so on. The way in which action is in the service of perception. How do you better understand what is in your environment? And the complement to that on the outside is where we perceive to act. So we're continually updating our mental understanding of the environment, and that is changing the way we behave, and that behavior exposes us to new aspects of the environment, maybe changes the environment, and so the cycle of action and perception continues. So this just frames our general concern, not with perception or experience as a passive process, but one of ongoing interaction with the environment. And this picture is Las Ramblas in Barcelona in more tranquil times. And what I want to emphasize here is there are two levels of perception, visual perception, if you like, going on. As we walk down the street, our attention may be drawn to a particular person or a tree or a facade of a building, and these may help us navigate our way through to meet somebody or to explore the architecture and so on, or to find a place to get a drink or the entrance to the metro. But at the same time, our peripheral vision is continually tracking the flow of movement around us. And so we may be walking along towards a target and suddenly jump out of the way without conscious thought to avoid a contact that has been signaled to us by our visual periphery. So that in the first case, we're talking about recognizing what objects are, what their relations are at a level that enters our awareness. At the other hand, we're saying we're continually interacting without having to think about the details. Our visual system fills in those details for us. And J.J. Gibson was the pioneer of getting us to think about this complementary form of perception, visual perception and other perception of the environment. Now, some of you know that Juhani Ballasmaa has been instrumental in organizing a series of three workshops in which architecture is linked to cognition and to neuroscience. And in fact, Harry and I were the honored guests on the first such occasion. But one of these was on architecture and atmosphere. And I just bring this into the conversation here to complement my emphasis more on practical action, interaction with the world, because in one of the essays there, Tonino Grifero talks about atmosphere as being a form of affordance. And I feel a little uncomfortable because I come from the Gibson tradition where I'm acting and here are opportunities for action. But in some sense, this is, to what extent is the building offering opportunities for emotional experience or for mood setting and things of this kind. And so one of the offerings, I think, for neuroscience is to say, okay, some of you are over here studying emotion and some of you are over here studying affordances for action in manual action or locomotion as given by the visual system. Are there common principles that could unite what seem to be these very diverse things? Or is it just a fancy of Grifero to label atmosphere as an affordance? So these are some of the ways we can get the conversation going where we're asking new questions of the neuroscientist as well as offering new ideas back to the architect. Let me talk briefly about perception, visual perception. This is an old computer model that my colleagues engaged in. But what I want to emphasize is the way, in general, we don't look at an object and understand it immediately. It requires construction, not necessarily conscious construction. There may be subconscious processes. But as our eyes move, we build up our overall perception of the image. And this first slide just makes the point that although we can get the gist of an image in a brief glance, in general, we need to break the image into pieces to have targets for our perceptual knowledge. And so this is where, in fact, a lot of neuroscience has been successful. We know in visual cortex, there are cells which can respond to edge and texture and color and depth. And we have a fair understanding of the processes whereby we can bring that together to say, well, here are little edges. How do they provide a contour? Here are patches of color. How do they provide a region? How do these compete and cooperate to yield a segmentation of the image? So at the bottom here, I show you a segmentation of that image. And there's a missing edge, which you might notice. And if we had more time together, I'd tell you about that edge. But instead, let me just go on and look at the process of competition and cooperation at a higher level. So, for example, we might know in outdoor scenes, if there is a region at the top of the image that is bluish, grayish, brownish, that's probably sky. And so the process here might get going by saying that top region, I have a 0.9. When I say I have, this is the neural representations competing, a 0.9. Now the region below it is fairly near the top of the image. It's fairly large. It has a bluish, grayish color, if we went back to the original image. But it's not as high as the first region, and so it might get a 0.3 of being sky. But now the visual system, see, notice I'm not talking about action here. I'm talking about context and relationships and knowledge of geometry and color and position. And here we get into the idea that if you have a region that is just beneath the sky, has this sort of parallelepiped shape, then it's probably roof. And once you've got that, that creates the hypothesis, and unless we're looking at a disaster scene in the Caribbean, there's probably a house underneath the roof. And so to verify our recognition of that roof, we look for clues underneath that it's a house. And so the process goes to completion. So I just want to give you that little taste of what could be a 1-hour lecture of the way in which perception, we may look at the original picture and not even realize that our brain has to do anything. Hey, I can see a house in front of this and that. But that required this process of interaction of some things competing, so I can only see the sky or the roof in that particular region, others cooperating. The sky here makes it more likely that's the roof there, and so on. And that's a constructive process. And so finally, let's get back to that promised, not finally for the talk, don't get up yet, but finally for this segment, let's talk a little bit about this idea of memory and then carry it forward into imagination. So perhaps you know that one of the growth areas in the interaction between neuroscience and architecture has been in the discussion of wayfinding, though I think in this case it's been more showing the relationship between the neuroscience and the architecture rather than offering new tools. But the top diagram shows a cross-section through the hippocampus. You met a figure of Ramoni Cajal's earlier in Sarah's talk. And at the right, the tracery, the fine tracery, is the path of a rat running around this little arena. And the red dots are where a single cell in the rat's hippocampus fired as the rat moved around. And what happens, you see, is that you've got a fair localization of where you are in the world. And if you have many of those cells between them, they provide a distributed representation of precisely where the rat is. So John O'Keefe got the Nobel Prize for his studies, which showed there were these representations of place. And again, there's a big discussion about different ideas of place. I won't get into that, but what's intriguing is that this poor guy, referred to in the literature as HM, back in the 50s had such uncontrollable epilepsy that the same brain region of his, the hippocampus with the surrounding temporal lobe, was excised. And he was such afterwards that if you talked to him, it seemed quite normal. But if you left the room and came back a couple of minutes later, he had no recollection of ever seeing you before. And so this got the idea that memory is, that there are memories of episodes, and then it turned out he could learn new games. So he had new procedural memory, learning new skills, but he couldn't form new memories of episodes in his life. And this fitted into our unfolding ideas. But what I really was concerned about after reading Zumthor was, what is this idea of memories come to mind, half forgotten, nothing is, everything is new. And so I find that there's a whole literature now where we're looking at human brain imaging and trying to look at what is the overlap. So, for example, here's a paper by a group at Harvard on the future of memory, nicely titled, Remembering, Imagining in the Brain. And as one probes into this literature, something interesting happens. One is one begins to see what are the brain regions that are most strongly activated in both memory and imagination, but what are the areas that are more active in one than the other? And what I find is that as I look at the new papers, they come to a dead end because they lack the sort of computational analysis I tried to exemplify briefly for you by looking in detail at that perception as construction. So speaking now with my neuroscience hat on, I see a lot of things to be done in developing computational understanding of brain process in partnership with the neuroscientists doing their brain imaging or their animal studies, and then, as I say, working with you to bring in new questions to explore as we imagine the future. But how does this imagination of the kind that these experimentalists are looking at relate to the sort of bringing the new images in that an architect like Zumthor has? That's a big question for us. Okay, in the last part of this talk, I want to examine the Sydney Opera House and the work of Utzon and try to understand what memories came to his mind as he worked on this. And in a sense, this is a personal issue because I grew up in Sydney, and the competition for the Opera House was completed as I finished high school. There was concrete in the ground and little bars rising up for it as I finished university. And 10 years after my PhD, they held the first public performance there. So it's anyway, here it is. And I want to start with the terms of the competition. And then a debate, in a sense, appropriate to this venue is to what extent was Utzon coming up with an appropriate new reality for this site, and to what extent was he missing opportunities to capture what was already there? Well, if we look here, we see Benalong Point on the top right. We see it extending up as it was about the time I was finishing high school. There were tram sheds below. You can see the Sydney trams of that day. But we see what was the dominant feature at that time, about 25 years old, the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So a new intervention which transformed our understanding of Sydney Harbour. And what Utzon realized, and others didn't, was that relation of this site to the Harbour Bridge was as important as the relation of this to the domain, the public gardens on the other side there. And I should say my house is at the top left corner there. So, interestingly, the program for the competition was extremely simple. It basically said, hey, Benalong Point is a wonderful place, perhaps without equal in the world. It has dimension, space, and beauty essential for the type of building that should be constructed, but the details were very simple indeed. It said we need 2 auditoriums of this size, we need additional spaces for rehearsal, we need a restaurant, etc., etc. But one of the things that I think Utzon was attracted by was the very freedom the program offered him. And it's interesting to look at the top 3 entries to see how very differently, if it's true that form follows function, it's very hard to define what the function was that differed so much for these 3 architects. And And it comes down, I think, to making some very big decisions. So the third entry, top left, said, okay, you want 2 auditoriums? I'm going to give you two buildings. The second entry, which I think actually would have been quite an adornment if we'd gone ahead with it, said, I'm going to give you 2 buildings, but they're going to be unified into one with the sort of backstage area shared between the two. And it's going to have this circular structure and this high tower in the middle. But Utzon came up with two viewpoints that we'll talk about more as we go on. One was, as you can see at the bottom right, he decided to put the 2 auditoriums side by side. And we'll see later a photo that suggests why that was appropriate for the site. And secondly, he took into account that location relative to the Sydney Harbour Bridge, both for giving you a viewpoint from above, very different from, complementary to the viewpoint from sailing your yacht on the harbour, but also providing a view like this. So the winning entry was hailed by the jury by saying the unity of its structural expression creates a striking architectural composition admirably suited to Benalong Point. The white sail-like forms of the shell vaults relate naturally to the harbour as sails to yachts. And I just show this picture to sort of make a polemic point that I don't think those are sails, they're shells. And a little later I'll tell you what I think they came from. But so what were the images that came to mind as Utzon moved to this? Well, one was just new developments in architecture, the idea of the concrete shell that offered new freedoms. So we can see the Raleigh Stadium at the left, but perhaps even more important was the TWA terminal of Eero Saarinen, who in fact seemed to have played the deciding role on the jury. Not for that reason, but this building was not constructed fully until after the jury had rendered its verdict, but the designs were already available and were part of the inspiration. And just for those of you who were unlucky enough not to get to the terminal while it was in use, I must say that running through this incredible space inside, if one's plane was delayed, made up for having to wait longer because of the affordances it gave one for movement and exploration before one went up the tunnel to the gate. I think that the big inspiration for the shape of the shells in the first place was the hulls of boats. And so I offer this quote from Jörn talking about his father. I have benefited greatly from the many hours I have spent with my father, who was a marine architect and ran the shipyards in Helsingfors, attached to a large shipyard where all trades were represented and large-scale work was carried out. When I was about to draw the Sydney Opera House, I was not really worried. Why? Because I had worked so much on understanding the hulls of boats. And so I had no worry about if I could see a 60-foot hull of a boat, why worry about these great shells? And that was the root of what ultimately proved to be the tragedy of Utzon's involvement with the Opera House, because in fact, if you will, failing to heed Zumthor's advice about paying attention to the skill of the craftsman, he had not thought through how to transfer the skill of the boatwright working in wood to the contractor working in concrete. Anyway, let me close with 4 principles or 4 design features that give some sense of the way the images that came to Utzon's mind affected his work. So one is just this idea that's already been stressed, was the building would be seen from all sides, not only from the harbour and from the domain and from the circular quay and so on, but also from above, from the harbour bridge as people crossed it. But the images that came to mind were not just the particularities of Sydney, which he had not visited at the time he entered the competition and won it. But as a boy, he had boated around Helsingfors, a peninsula with this castle on it. And I think that this is a place, to use the phrase, charged with poetic memory, so that although the building is nothing like the Sydney Opera House, the site doesn't have the hills that rise up from Sydney Harbour, nonetheless, it provided this notion of boats on a harbour. And I think this next picture, while making clear the difference, also has the yacht carefully positioned to give us some sense of how the image could come to mind and affect both the idea of what could be taken, but also what had to change. The second design feature I've already mentioned was the idea of placing the buildings side by side. I want to make 2 points here. One is the view before and after Benalong Point in the 50s and now, and you can see how his disposition of the opera houses filled this space and made full use of it, rather than saying, okay, here's so many square feet, I'll put buildings down in the middle of it. The other thing I want to emphasize is we'll see one of the interesting things about Utzon was the dissociation, if you will, of exterior from interior. The shape of his designed auditoriums was quite different from the shape of the roofs. Nonetheless, you can see here the conversation of the two auditoriums and what they require, and the restaurant by the side provided a footprint for which that iconic exterior grew. So the design principle 3, one more to go after this, is the opera house would be formed in 3 layers. There would be a platform containing the hidden workings of the opera house, the performance space above this, the roof as the shelter. So without reading all that text, what images had come to mind? It's, as Harry will tell you, the idea of the platform and building on that is age-old. We can all think of Greek temples, for example. But the particular images that, from his biographical comments, seem to have come to mind for Utzon were the pagoda roof of the temple above the Chinese temple, and the steps leading up to the platform in buildings in Mexico. And in a 1962 essay, he came up with this drawing on the right, which in some sense attested to this idea of separating the platform and the roof from what was within, the idea of clouds floating above, or looking at the pagoda roof as floating in dissociation from, but with then the temple or the opera house to be interposed within it. And so we see the final sketch where we begin to have something rather concrete in both senses, moored to a platform. But even then, we had to have a separate inspiration for how that tripartite strategy was to be transferred. And what I've done at the bottom here of this picture is to take Age Utzon's boat and tilt it through 90 degrees and suggest that it looks a lot more like one of Utzon's shells than would a sail. But having gone through all these different aspects, again, we're back to Zumthor's statement, all is new, and there is no direct reference to former works of architecture. Okay, this is the penultimate slide, and this comes back to affordances, that Utzon had a very strong idea of how to design the auditoriums and how to provide access to them. And as many of you know, the tragedy was that his failure to think through how his shells could be actually constructed led to years of delay, cost overruns, till finally his resignation was accepted in 1966. And he left the country and never returned and never saw his building. That's the tragedy, but we do get some part of his vision of the affordances for experience, that the idea was that you come in underneath, and then there are steps leading to an entry hall, which is common to both of the auditoriums. And then from that entry hall, you can proceed up either side of each auditorium with doors. So his idea was that from your car or walking in from Circular Quay, there's this stately procession up through the entrance, up to either side of the auditorium. But then the thing that really adds to his vision is that those stairs preceded, and behind the auditorium there are lobbies. And those lobbies are designed to give spectacular views of the harbour. So he'd really thought through both the affordances of the crowd entering and leaving the auditoriums in a stately procession, but also this way that before and after the performance there would be these opportunities to really explore the setting in which this had been provided. Well, what I want to do in conclusion is just say this is just the beginning of what I think you may already sense from the enthusiastic comments that have preceded me, and you will have enriched by what comes next, is a fruitful conversation between architecture and neuroscience. And the one ingredient I've tried to add is the conversation is not one way. It's not that we already have a static set of understandings of the brain, here they are, please plug them in, but that the reason 30,000 people go to the Society for Neuroscience meeting each year is because there's a lot of ongoing research. And so I think it's also an exciting challenge for this group to say, what are the questions that we can ask to complement the, how can you help me with this part of my design? What are the complements we can ask? Well, what are exciting basic understandings of the nature of the human mind and brain? Thank you very much.